Right now, as we speak this morning, the most important political meeting in Canadian history could be unfolding in Ottawa. Prime Minister Mark Carney has gathered every single provincial and territorial premier for a First Minister's meeting that begins at 9 o'clock. And what happens in that room over the next few hours could determine whether Canada survives as an economic nation or becomes a vassal state to Donald Trump's America. The stakes, only $3.6 billion crossing the border every single day, 75% of Canadian exports, and the future of the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement that has protected Canadian businesses from complete economic annihilation. But here's what makes this morning absolutely explosive. Carney walks into this meeting with Trump threatening 100% tariffs on everything Canada exports, the Treasury Secretary calling him a virtue-signaling technocrat who should shut up and comply, and his own provincial premiers divided right down the middle on whether to fight back or surrender. This isn't a routine policy discussion. This is Canada's economic survival hanging by a thread, and the thread is being cut from both sides. Let me paint you the picture of how we got to this powder keg moment. Just 9 days ago, Mark Carney stood on a stage in Davos, Switzerland at the World Economic Forum and delivered what some are calling the most defiant speech by a Canadian leader in modern history. He looked out at the world's most powerful people and told them the truth nobody wanted to hear. The post-Cold War international order is experiencing a rupture, not a transition. Great powers are using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion. And middle powers like Canada, Carney said, have a choice. Compete with each other for favor from superpowers, or combine to create a third path with real impact. He called it living within the truth, borrowing from Václav Havel's writings about resisting authoritarian pressure. He argued that when middle powers only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, they negotiate from weakness, accept what's offered, compete to be the most accommodating. That's not sovereignty, Carney declared. That's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. Now, Carney never mentioned Trump's name. He didn't have to. Everyone in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. Trump had just spent weeks threatening to buy Greenland, calling Canada the 51st state, imposing crushing tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, copper, and lumber, and generally treating America's closest ally like a colonial possession waiting to be absorbed. The Davos speech was Carney's line in the sand. And Trump lost his mind. The next day, Trump got up at Davos and responded directly. Canada lives because of the United States, he said. They should be grateful to us. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your remarks. Within hours, Trump revoked Carney's invitation to something called the Board of Peace, this weird new international council Trump had created. The message was clear. Criticize Trump and you're out. But the Davos speech, as bold as it was, wasn't happening in a vacuum. Carney had just returned from China, where he'd negotiated a preliminary trade deal that would see Beijing lower tariffs on Canadian canola and other agricultural products in exchange for Ottawa allowing up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market at reduced tariff rates. For prairie provinces like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, which export massive amounts of canola, this was a lifeline. China had slapped brutal tariffs on Canadian canola oil and meal, and farmers were getting crushed. The deal would see those tariffs drop from 85% down to 15% starting March 1st. That's real money for Canadian farmers. But for Ontario and its auto manufacturing base, this looked like Carney selling them out to benefit the prairies. Doug Ford was furious. Chinese electric vehicles getting preferential access? That could undermine Ontario's auto industry, already battered by Trump's 25% tariffs on vehicles and parts. And Trump went ballistic. On Saturday, January 24th, Trump posted on Truth Social that if Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the United States. 100%. That means doubling the price of everything Canada exports to America. He accused Carney of trying to make Canada a drop-off port for Chinese goods to flood into the American market. If Governor Carney thinks he's going to do that, Trump wrote, he is sorely mistaken. Governor Carney, not Prime Minister. Trump deliberately demoted him, treating Canada's elected leader like a regional administrator in the Trump empire. Now, here's where it gets even more complicated. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, jumped into the fight this week with both feet. On Wednesday, Bessent went on CNBC and basically told Carney to shut up and know his place. He said Carney should stop virtue signaling and do what's best for the Canadian people, not score cheap political points before the CUSMA negotiations. Then Bessent said something really revealing. In my investment career, I've seen what happens when a technocrat tries to pivot and become a politician. It never really works out well. That was a direct shot at Carney's background as former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England before he entered politics. Bessent was saying, "You're an economist, not a leader. Get back in your lane." But the most explosive claim came Monday night when Bessent told Fox News that Carney had called Trump after the Davos speech and was very aggressively walking back some of the unfortunate remarks he made. Bessent claimed Carney basically apologized and backed down. Carney immediately called that a lie. On Tuesday, standing on Parliament Hill, Carney told reporters, "To be absolutely clear, and I said this to the president, I meant what I said in Davos." He said they had discussed Ukraine, Venezuela, Arctic security, and Canada's new trade partnerships around the world. Carney said Trump was impressed by the 12 new trade deals Canada has signed across 4 continents in 6 months. So who's lying? Either Bessent is completely misrepresenting a phone call to make Trump look strong and Carney look weak, or Carney is publicly contradicting his own private surrender. Either way, it shows you the level of bad faith and chaos in U.S.-Canada relations right now. And that brings us to this morning's First Ministers meeting. Carney has invited all 13 provincial and territorial premiers to Ottawa for what's being billed as a Team Canada moment, a show of unity before the CUSMA negotiations begin in earnest this summer. The meeting started at 9 o'clock this morning, following a dinner last night where presumably Carney tried to get everyone on the same page. Then at 2:15 this afternoon, Carney will hold a media availability to announce whatever they've agreed to. But here's the problem. Team Canada is fractured, possibly beyond repair. The premiers are not united. They're not even close. Doug Ford, Ontario's premier, is calling for maximum retaliation against Trump. Ford wants Canada to hit back hard with counter tariffs, cut off electricity exports to the United States, do whatever it takes to make Americans feel pain. Ford has said repeatedly, you can't have tariffs on one side and not the other. He's accused Trump of attacking the entire Canadian economy and says Canada needs to stand united. United we stand, divided we fall, Ford said. He's positioned himself as the leading voice for Canadian economic nationalism, the guy who won't back down to Trump. Ford even suggested Canada should launch massive infrastructure projects using Canadian steel to boost national morale and economic activity, maybe build an aircraft carrier, something big and symbolic. But Danielle Smith, Alberta's premier, is on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Smith has been to Mar-a-Lago to meet with Trump personally. She's appeared on Fox News and Fox Business multiple times. And her message is consistent. Do not use Alberta's energy exports as a weapon against the United States. Alberta sends 4 million barrels of oil per day to America. That's 60% of U.S. crude oil imports. If Canada threatened to cut that off, it would send gasoline prices through the roof in the American Midwest and potentially force Trump to back down. Ford has been begging Smith to consider an export tax on oil as leverage, but Smith has flatly refused. She said it would cost hundreds of thousands of jobs overnight. It would be absurd and self-destructive, and she will never agree to it. Smith's position is that Alberta's economy is too dependent on American energy purchases to risk any retaliation that could blow back on the oil patch. This isn't just a policy disagreement. This is a fundamental split about whether Canada should fight Trump or accommodate him. Ford represents Central Canada's manufacturing base, which is getting hammered by tariffs on autos, steel, and aluminum. Smith represents Western Canada's energy industry, which so far has been mostly exempted from the worst tariffs. The political geography matters here. A study last year found that Albertans are far more likely than Ontarians to identify primarily with their province, rather than with Canada as a whole. Smith has made Alberta first her rallying cry. Ford is pushing Canada first. These are incompatible visions. And it's not just Ford versus Smith. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew is angry about Chinese tariffs on Manitoba pork products and wants Carney to produce an off-ramp to get those tariffs lifted. British Columbia Premier David Eby is furious that Carney has signaled support for a new coastal pipeline to export Alberta oil through BC ports, which Eby sees as an environmental disaster. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe, meanwhile, has actually praised Carney's China deal because it helps canola farmers. And Moe has even suggested Canada should consider removing some of its counter tariffs because they're hurting Canadian businesses more than American ones. The premiers are all over the map, literally and figuratively. So what is Carney hoping to accomplish in this meeting? Sources say the agenda includes coordinating Canada's economic strategy, supporting industries hit by tariffs, planning major infrastructure projects, and most importantly, getting everyone aligned on the CUSMA negotiations that are scheduled to begin formally this summer. The Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, which replaced NAFTA in 2020 during Trump's first term, has a mandatory review every 6 years. That review is due by July 1st of this year. Under the agreement, if the 3 countries can't agree to extend CUSMA for another 16 years, it stays in place, but they have to meet every year until 2036 to discuss extension. That sounds stable, but there's a catch. Any country can withdraw from CUSMA with just 6 months' notice at any time. Trump has repeatedly hinted he might do exactly that. He's called CUSMA irrelevant, said it offers no real advantages to the United States, and suggested he might negotiate separate bilateral deals with Canada and Mexico instead. The stakes could not possibly be higher. 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States and Mexico under CUSMA. That's roughly $900 billion in annual trade. Nearly 90% of Canada's exports to the U.S. are currently CUSMA compliant and therefore exempt from Trump's reciprocal tariffs of 35%. But even with those protections, Canadian exports have tanked. In October, Canada reported the lowest level of exports to the United States since 1997 outside of pandemic disruptions. Non-energy export volumes in the third quarter of last year were down 11% compared to just before American tariffs were implemented. Even producers of CUSMA-compliant goods saw exports drop markedly. The uncertainty alone is killing Canadian business investment and confidence. And here's what keeps Canadian negotiators up at night. Trump doesn't play by the rules. The CUSMA agreement explicitly allows the president to impose tariffs for essential security reasons. Trump has been using Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to justify tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, and vehicles as national security threats. Courts have ruled against him, but he just appeals and keeps the tariffs in place during the legal process. He's also threatened 25% tariffs on any country that buys Iranian oil, which could hit Canadian energy companies with global operations. Trump's entire approach is to use tariffs as leverage in endless negotiations, extracting concessions, investment commitments, and policy changes from countries desperate to maintain market access. It's economic coercion, exactly what Carney warned about in Davos. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer has already laid out a series of demands for extending CUSMA. He told Congress in December that CUSMA has been successful to a certain degree, but there need to be changes. What changes? We don't know all of them yet, but Greer has mentioned Canada's dairy supply management system and beer distribution rules as particular irritants. Trump has been fixated on the U.S. trade deficit with Canada. He's told Danielle Smith personally that the biggest source of his irritation is the trade imbalance. Never mind that if you exclude energy, the United States actually runs a trade surplus with Canada. Trump wants the numbers to look different, and he's willing to blow up CUSMA to get there. Meanwhile, Canada has been on a diplomatic blitz trying to reduce dependence on American trade. Carney has signed 12 new trade and security partnerships across 4 continents in the 6 months since he became prime minister. He's visited China, Qatar, and Switzerland. He's met with French President Emmanuel Macron, Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Canada is trying to build a trading network that gives it more leverage and more options if the relationship with America continues to deteriorate. But here's the brutal reality. You can't replace 75% of your export market overnight. It takes years, maybe decades, to build supply chains, establish logistics networks, develop customer relationships in new markets. Canada can diversify at the margins, but the American market is irreplaceable in the short to medium term. So Carney walks into this First Minister's meeting this morning with an almost impossible task. He needs to convince 13 premiers with wildly different economic interests and political ideologies to present a united front to Donald Trump. He needs Ford to stop publicly attacking Smith, and Smith to stop undermining Team Canada by cozying up to Trump. He needs to sell the China deal to Ontario, and the pipeline plan to British Columbia, and the pork tariff solution to Manitoba. He needs to project strength while keeping the door open for negotiations. He needs to stand firm on Canadian sovereignty while acknowledging economic dependence on the United States. And he needs to do all of this while Trump and Bessent are actively trying to divide and humiliate him. The timing of this meeting is particularly interesting because it's happening the same day the Conservative Party of Canada begins its 3-day political convention in Calgary. Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader who lost to Carney in last year's election, is facing an automatic leadership review. Poilievre was widely predicted to win that election before Trump's 51st state comments and perceived ideological alignment with Trump became major issues. Carney successfully positioned himself as the leader who would stand up to Trump and defend Canadian sovereignty. He won a 4th consecutive term for the Liberals in April 2025, specifically on that message. So this First Minister's meeting is partly about policy and partly about politics. Carney needs to show he's the leader who can keep Canada together and independent, while Poilievre's party is gathering in Calgary to question whether he should remain their leader. The economic analysis coming out this week suggests Canada is actually in better shape than headlines indicate. Inflation has moderated, economic growth has been resilient despite tariffs, and fiscal policy has been supportive. The Bank of Canada has cut interest rates significantly, and household balance sheets have recovered. Some economists are cautiously optimistic that Canada can weather this storm if CUSMA protections remain in place. But every single analysis ends with the same caveat. If CUSMA falls apart, all bets are off. If Trump decides to withdraw or impose universal tariffs on Canadian goods, the Canadian economy could enter a severe recession almost overnight. That's not hyperbole. That's the reality of being a smaller economy utterly dependent on access to the world's largest consumer market. And there's a broader geopolitical dimension here that Carney understands better than most. His Davos speech wasn't just about trade, it was about the future of the international order. Carney believes we're living through a rupture where great powers like the United States and China are increasingly acting without constraint, using economic and military might to coerce smaller nations. And he believes middle powers, countries like Canada, Australia, South Korea, European nations, need to band together to protect the rules-based international system that has generally served them well since World War II. This is about more than tariffs on steel. This is about whether small and medium-sized democracies can maintain sovereignty and dignity in a world dominated by authoritarian-leaning superpowers. Trump's response to Carney's Davos speech revealed something important. Trump views Canada not as an ally or partner, but as a subordinate that needs to show proper deference. The 51st state comments, the Governor Carney insults, the Board of Peace revocation. These aren't negotiating tactics. They're assertions of dominance. Trump believes Canada should be grateful for American protection and market access, and should therefore comply with American demands without resistance. Carney's Davos speech rejected that framework entirely. He said Canada will build new partnerships, pursue strategic autonomy, and refuse to accept subordination disguised as sovereignty. That's why Trump is so angry. It's not about trade policy. It's about whether Canada will bow. What makes this morning's meeting so crucial is that it will reveal whether Canadian premiers are willing to back Carney's defiant stance or whether they'll break ranks and start negotiating individually with Trump. If Smith continues refusing to support federal strategy, if Ford breaks discipline and cuts his own deals, if other premiers decide their provincial interests matter more than national unity, then Carney's position becomes untenable. Trump thrives on division. He'll offer special deals to Alberta, sweetheart arrangements to Saskatchewan, anything to split the premiers and make Carney look weak and isolated. That's the playbook. The counter-argument, of course, is that Carney is being reckless. Critics say he's picking unnecessary fights with Canada's indispensable trading partner over matters of pride and principle, when the smart move would be to accommodate Trump's demands, keep American markets open, and wait out this administration. They point out that Trump will eventually leave office, but damage to the Canadian economy could last for years. They argue that Carney's Davos grandstanding might feel good emotionally, but it's making life harder for Canadian businesses that just want stable access to American customers. And they note that Carney's China deal, whatever its merits for farmers, has given Trump a perfect excuse to impose even more devastating tariffs. But here's what Carney would say, and what he has been saying. If Canada doesn't stand up now, when does it stand up? If Canada accepts economic subordination to avoid short-term pain, how does it ever regain genuine sovereignty? If middle powers like Canada don't band together to preserve a rules-based order, what's the alternative? A world where might makes right, where the strong do as they will and the weak suffer what they must? Carney genuinely believes that this is a defining moment, not just for Canada, but for all democracies that aren't superpowers. Either they collectively resist coercion and build alternative partnerships, or they individually surrender and hope for mercy. The meeting this morning will run for several hours, probably with intense debate behind closed doors. Then at 2:15 this afternoon, Carney will face the media. What will he say? Will he announce that all 13 premiers are united behind a tough negotiating stance? Will he reveal specific retaliatory measures? Will he make concessions to Smith and other reluctant premiers to keep them on side? Or will he have to admit that Team Canada is divided and hope that doesn't completely undermine his negotiating position with Trump? We're going to find out in a few hours, and the implications will ripple through the Canadian economy and political system for months or years to come. One thing is certain, this isn't the end of the crisis. Even if Carney gets the premiers united today, he still has to navigate the CUSMA negotiations starting this summer with a Trump administration that has shown zero good faith and every willingness to blow up long-standing agreements for short-term political gain. He still has to figure out how to reduce dependence on American markets without tanking industries that are deeply integrated into North American supply chains. He still has to manage Trump's personal animosity and Bessent's public contempt while maintaining the dignity of his office and his country. And he has to do all of this while his main political opponent, Poilievre, is waiting in the wings ready to say, "I told you so," if things go badly. The broader lesson here is about power in the 21st century. For decades, Canada thrived by being America's reliable partner, the friendly neighbor who didn't cause trouble and benefited from preferential access to American markets and security guarantees. That model worked when American foreign policy was relatively stable and predictable, when trade agreements were honored, when personal relationships between leaders mattered. But Trump has shown that model can collapse overnight. A different American president with a different worldview can simply decide the old rules don't apply anymore. And what can Canada do about it? Not much if it's acting alone, maybe more if it's acting with other middle powers. That's Carney's bet. So as the premiers sit down with Carney this morning in Ottawa, they're not just discussing tariffs and trade negotiating positions. They're answering fundamental questions about Canadian identity and sovereignty. Is Canada a nation that can chart its own course, or is it ultimately an economic colony of the United States, dependent on American goodwill for survival? Can Canadian provinces put aside regional interests for national unity, or will they always choose local advantage over collective strength? Can Canadian leaders stand up to American pressure without destroying the economy, or is resistance ultimately futile? These are the questions that will be debated explicitly or implicitly in that room today, and the answers will define Canada for a generation. What we're watching unfold is not just a trade dispute. It's a referendum on whether middle powers have any agency in a world dominated by great power competition. Carney has staked his premiership on the argument that they do, that Canada doesn't have to choose between American hegemony and Chinese authoritarianism, that there's a third path built on partnerships with other democracies and rules-based institutions. Trump has staked his presidency on the opposite argument, that power is all that matters, that trade is warfare by other means, that America will impose its will on friend and foe alike. One of them is going to be proven right, and the Canadian economy is the testing ground. This morning's First Ministers' meeting is where we find out whether Canada will fight or fold. And folks, that decision is being made right now as we speak.